I never thought a single morning could change the entire trajectory of my life, but that Tuesday proved me wrong. The sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the countertops, but nothing about the house felt warm anymore. It was cold, not just in temperature, but in the absence of what I thought was love, trust, and stability. I had woken up that morning to what I assumed would be another ordinary day. Coffee brewing, the hum of the toaster in the background, the familiar chatter of our life. But there was an unusual silence that hung in the air, one so thick it made the familiar walls feel alien. And then I heard the words that made my world crumble, the ones I wish I could erase from memory. "I'm leaving. I'm with her now." It wasn't just any woman. It was my cousin. Someone I had laughed with at family gatherings, shared secrets with at sleepovers, someone I trusted implicitly. The betrayal cut sharper than anything I had ever imagined. My husband, the man I had thought would be my anchor, had chosen her over years of promises, over the life we built together, over me. There were no fights beforehand, no warning signs that were clear enough to decipher. Just a casual confession delivered as if it were a matter-of-fact announcement, like the weather, like he was informing me that the traffic was bad today. The audacity of his calmness made my chest tighten in disbelief, my hands tremble, and my mind race. How could someone who had vowed to love, protect, and choose you every day suddenly dissolve all the vows into a single moment of heartless clarity? I sank into the chair at the kitchen table, clutching my coffee cup like it was a lifeline. My mind raced, replaying the last months, the little signs I had ignored. The late-night phone calls, he said, were work emergencies. The sudden disinterest in shared plans, the vague excuses that sounded too rehearsed. It was all a script, carefully written and performed. And I, trusting and blinded by love, had been a spectator in my own life, never realizing the betrayal that was quietly brewing behind my back. There was an ache in my chest, but it was sharper, colder than sorrow. It was humiliation, the feeling that the people you trust the most can disregard your existence in the blink of an eye. And yet, amidst the storm of emotions, anger, grief, disbelief, self-doubt, there was a spark of clarity. A dangerous, beautiful thought that started as a whisper and grew louder with every heartbeat. I will not be broken. I will not allow their choices to dictate my worth. If he could choose her over me, then I would choose myself. The day they thought they were victorious, I decided, would instead mark the beginning of my rise. I left the kitchen without saying a word, ignoring the faint whine of his car keys jingling as he left for work. He expected tears, dramatic confrontations, perhaps even pleas. He expected me to crumble, but I had a plan forming in my mind, intricate and precise, like a blueprint for justice. I knew what they hadn't counted on, that my heart could fuel strategy, that betrayal could sharpen intelligence, and that revenge could be measured not in impulsive rage, but in calm, calculated action. The first thing I did was reclaim control of my environment. I went through our home meticulously, gathering every financial statement, every document, every little piece of leverage that had quietly accumulated in the background of our life together. My heart pounded, not with panic, but with focus. The anger that once threatened to consume me became a tool, a lens that allowed me to see every opportunity they had provided for my downfall, and how I could turn it into my ascent. I made a mental list: access codes, bank accounts, shared subscriptions, passwords, insurance documents. Every thread of our life that had been entwined in joint comfort was now an asset I could wield. Not to destroy them, not to create chaos for its own sake, but to make them face the reality they had chosen. They had assumed my loyalty was unconditional, that my presence was a permanent fixture, that I would silently fix everything. They were wrong. The control they exercised was fragile, contingent upon my continued compliance. And for the first time, I realized that compliance was optional. Then came the hardest part, controlling the narrative, not letting emotion sabotage the plan. I couldn't let him see the storm raging inside me. I couldn't let anyone perceive weakness. Every call, every email, every interaction was deliberate, neutral, calculated. I would build my life silently, patiently, while their assumptions about my vulnerability allowed me to operate without resistance. Revenge, I learned, wasn't a moment. It was a series of small, intelligent moves that culminated in undeniable consequences. I rented a studio apartment the same afternoon. It wasn't fancy, just enough space for clarity, for action, for freedom. The moment I stepped into that empty space, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration gripped me. I had nothing but the essentials: my laptop, a few personal items, and an unwavering determination. Yet that emptiness was liberating. Every wall, every corner was a canvas, a testament to autonomy. I could breathe, think, plan, and act without the constant interference of those who had underestimated me. That night, as I lay on the bare floor, the hum of city life drifting through the windows, I crafted the first stage of my strategy. It involved precision, timing, and psychological leverage. Every move had to be subtle yet impactful. I would make them understand the cost of their choices, not through confrontation, but through consequence. They had assumed my love would equate to silent compliance. They would learn that love could coexist with boundaries, and that consequences, no matter how delayed, were inevitable. And in that quiet apartment, I realized something profound. Revenge isn't about destruction, it's about transformation. By reclaiming my time, my money, my energy, and my dignity, I was already executing the most effective form of retaliation. They would see the absence of my sacrifice reflected in their own struggles. They would face the gaps I left behind, and in those gaps, they would comprehend the value of the person they had discarded. This first evening ended with a sense of control I had never felt in years. The betrayal still burned, but it was no longer a liability, it was fuel. Every memory of his smirk, every recollection of her whispered compliments, every passing thought of the life I had thought we shared became a driving force. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the day they thought they had won, I had already begun to write the narrative of my victory. The morning after I moved into the studio, I made a list, not of grievances, not of past mistakes, but of opportunities. My life had been quietly dictated by others for too long. Their comfort had always come at the expense of my time, my money, my energy. Now, with a small apartment in Queens and a single laptop as my arsenal, I realized I had everything I needed to reclaim myself. I started with finances. For years, I had let him control the joint accounts, let him handle bills while I silently poured money into the cracks they had created. But now, every dollar was mine to manage, every decision mine to make. I created spreadsheets, budgets, and emergency plans. I mapped out how to survive and thrive without relying on anyone who had shown me betrayal disguised as normalcy. Then I turned my attention to the emotional battlefield. I would not allow grief to dictate my actions. Anger had to be sharpened into strategy. I had learned that people underestimate calm determination far more than emotional outbursts. My husband assumed I would beg, plead, or cry, that I would expose every vulnerability in a desperate attempt to reclaim what he had taken. He didn't understand that my silence could be more devastating than any words. By stepping away, by walking out with measured steps, I already inflicted a type of punishment that words could never reach. Every day he would wake, every evening he would return home, he would feel the absence of my presence, the absence of my compliance, my support, my approval. That absence would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I also began building my professional fortress. I poured energy into my work with a new intensity. My laptop became a weapon of reclamation. Projects that I had previously taken for granted became avenues of power and validation. Deadlines, client communications, even small personal milestones were now for me, not for anyone else to benefit from. The late nights I had spent silently fixing household issues, covering expenses, and maintaining the fragile facade of family stability were replaced by focused creativity, tangible results, and personal growth. Every contract I signed, every design I completed, was a brick in the wall separating my life from theirs. And while I was forging this independence, I also considered the psychological elements at play. They would not comprehend this methodical withdrawal immediately. He would text, she would call, and in those moments I remained composed. I didn't answer impulsively. I let their anxiety build naturally. They would begin to realize that their life, which they assumed I had held together effortlessly, required my constant intervention. They would feel the absence of someone who had quietly solved every problem, every emergency, every minor disaster. For the first time, the convenience of my existence would become an undeniable void. My strategy extended beyond just them noticing. It was also about my own perception. I needed to walk through this period with dignity and clarity. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about public embarrassment or dramatic confrontation. It was about creating undeniable consequences while improving oneself simultaneously. I was transforming betrayal into fuel for growth, resentment into structured planning, and grief into a roadmap for autonomy. Each day in the quiet of my new apartment reinforced that lesson. By focusing inward, I was already succeeding where they had assumed I would fail. And then came the first test. My husband called, a casual tone that belied the storm I suspected lurked beneath. "Hey," he said, "can we talk?" It sounded like an attempt at reconnection, perhaps manipulation. I responded with neutral civility. "I'm busy with a client presentation. Can we schedule a time later?" He hesitated, realizing my calmness wasn't an invitation. That was the first crack in his assumption that I would react emotionally. That first interaction reminded me that withdrawal was its own weapon. It wasn't revenge in the theatrical sense. It was the subtle assertion of boundaries that had been absent for years. Meanwhile, my cousin, she didn't know what she had stepped into. For months, she had basked in the glow of betrayal, convinced that I would quietly step aside, that loyalty to family could be overridden by desire for convenience and comfort. She had no idea that I was systematically reclaiming my life piece by piece. I observed from a distance, aware of her attempts to establish herself in the space that had once been mine. Every casual comment she made about finally being happy together felt like fuel for my planning. I didn't react with confrontation. I reacted with preparation. Every minor victory she assumed she had achieved would ultimately pale against the strategy I had set in motion. The next week, I began documenting everything: expenses, communications, instances of entitlement, patterns of behavior. It was methodical, almost surgical. I kept logs of messages, screenshots of transactions, detailed notes of interactions. This was no longer just about emotion, it was about accountability. When people believe their actions have no consequences, they act with reckless disregard. I wanted them to understand, quietly and inevitably, that choices have costs, and that I was no longer absorbing them silently. This wasn't about revenge in the sense of anger. It was about delivering clarity through undeniable reality. I also began reinforcing my own support system. Friends who had been distant or casual acquaintances suddenly became allies in subtle ways. I reached out for advice, shared minor details about logistics, and fortified my network. I realized that independence wasn't about isolation. It was about surrounding myself with people who acknowledged my autonomy rather than assumed my compliance. Each interaction reinforced that I was no longer the silent servant of their comfort, but an individual with agency, skill, and control over my own life. And in the quiet moments, as I sipped my coffee and stared out the window at the street below, I realized that the greatest revenge wouldn't come from confrontation. Confrontation wasn't necessary. The real payoff would be their awakening, the realization that life without me was not easier, more convenient, or harmless. That absence would hurt more than any argument ever could. I didn't need to yell, I didn't need to accuse. I only needed to continue building, documenting, and living. By the end of the first week, I had set in motion a chain of events that would inevitably expose the fragility of their assumptions. Every missed payment they scrambled to cover, every logistical challenge that had been my silent responsibility, would now reveal the depth of their reliance. And all the while, I would thrive, personally, professionally, and emotionally. I would let the absence of my support speak louder than words ever could. By the second week, the impact of my absence began to ripple through their lives in ways that were both predictable and satisfying. The small, everyday emergencies that I had once resolved without thought were now crises. Bills went unpaid, deadlines for utility payments loomed, and the house felt smaller and colder, not physically, but emotionally. Each knock of consequence was a quiet confirmation of the truth I had been living with for years. I had been the linchpin holding their fragile structure together. And now, stepping back, I could finally see the extent of the damage, not out of cruelty, but as a reflection of the reality they had never considered. My husband, caught in the middle of his own confusion and guilt, began to realize that convenience had a price. His usual flippancy, the smirk that once accompanied his manipulations, was replaced by a tense calculation. Every minor disruption in his carefully curated life now traced back to a single factor. I was no longer the one silently fixing it. He reached out a few times, ostensibly to discuss logistics or figure things out, but his tone betrayed the realization that my compliance was no longer a given. I responded consistently, calmly, with measured boundaries. Each response reinforced a simple, undeniable fact. I was present in my own life first, and the debts of past obligations would no longer define me. Meanwhile, my cousin, who had assumed she was entering a world of unchallenged influence, began to encounter subtle resistance. The space she thought she could claim with impunity was now layered with my presence, my preparation, and my newfound confidence. She tried to assert dominance, to remind everyone of her happiness with my husband, but it was clear that her assumed power was superficial. She had underestimated my ability to operate quietly, strategically, and without theatrics. Every casual victory she assumed she had achieved was being systematically neutralized by my careful withdrawal and the structure I had rebuilt around myself. I also began asserting my independence in tangible ways that affected their day-to-day lives. Instead of calling at the first sign of a problem, I allowed them to experience the consequences of neglect and entitlement. The missing payments, the late fees, the confusion, they were small, almost trivial in isolation, but collectively they became a mirror reflecting the years of unnoticed labor I had contributed. I didn't celebrate these moments, I observed them. I allowed them to learn the lesson that I had been silently teaching myself for months, that self-preservation requires deliberate boundaries, and that the absence of enabling can be more powerful than confrontation. Professionally, I accelerated my efforts. Clients noticed the shift in my energy, the precision in my work, and the intensity of my focus. I took on more challenging projects, negotiated better rates, and invested in tools and resources that would have been considered extravagant in my old life. But now, every purchase, every upgrade was a direct investment in my own growth. I realized that revenge, in its most effective form, didn't require humiliation or public exposure. It required creating a life that my betrayers could not touch, a life where my value was demonstrated, not debated. I also began reconstructing my personal identity, the part of myself that had been subsumed under years of silent labor and compliance. I joined local groups, took classes I had postponed for years, and began cultivating hobbies that were purely my own. Each step was an assertion of autonomy, a reminder that my identity could not be dictated by the needs, desires, or expectations of others. Living this truth was, in itself, a form of revenge, the most profound kind. It was proof that betrayal could not contain or define me, and that self-respect was not a negotiable currency. By the end of the first month, the transformation was visible, subtle yet undeniable. My husband began to approach me with caution, aware that his usual manipulations were no longer effective. My cousin, who had assumed her position was secure, now treated me with a grudging recognition that my withdrawal carried weight. And my mother, who had always treated my support as a constant, began to face the reality that I would not silently absorb her financial instability any longer. It was not instant enlightenment, but the first cracks had formed, and they were sufficient. Then came the defining moment. A particularly cold week, the furnace went out and the household faced a real emergency. In the past, I would have rushed to fix it, absorbed the cost, and ensured everyone's comfort. This time, I allowed them to navigate the problem themselves. They scrambled, called repairmen, negotiated costs, and argued over priorities. My absence was keenly felt, and in those moments of struggle, the lesson became unmistakable. I had always been a resource, not an obligation, and independence requires everyone to assume responsibility. By midweek, my husband attempted direct engagement. He called with a tone of desperation masked by casual familiarity. "Can you help us with this? I know you've been busy, but—" I interrupted gently but firmly. "I'll help once with conditions. After that, it's on you. You need to handle your responsibilities without me as a backup." The pause on the line was long and telling. The weight of his assumptions, the years of entitlement, had finally collided with the reality of boundaries. He was forced to confront the consequences of his choices, not in theory, but in practical, unavoidable experience. Over the following weeks, small signs of change began to surface. Payments were made on time, responsibilities were delegated, and the household operated with a tentative but growing awareness of accountability. My presence was no longer a silent cushion for their mistakes. It became conditional, deliberate, and respected. They were learning slowly that life required effort from everyone, not just me. And I, in turn, was thriving, building a life of autonomy, self-respect, and tangible success. The ultimate revenge was not in anger or humiliation. It was in the quiet reclamation of my own power. I had removed myself from the equation, forced them to face the consequences, and used that absence to rebuild a life that was undeniably mine. My career flourished, my independence solidified, and my personal growth accelerated. I had demonstrated that the most effective form of retaliation is not chaos or confrontation. It is the creation of a life so complete, so separate, and so self-sufficient that those who wronged you can only watch, powerless, as you thrive. And so, 6 months later, I could sit in my studio, sunlight streaming over the hardwood floor, and reflect on what had happened. My family, once reliant on me for survival, had begun to learn responsibility. My husband, my cousin, my mother, they had all faced consequences for their choices, not through punishment, but through the natural result of withdrawal. And I had gained everything: peace, autonomy, respect, and a life that belonged entirely to me. Revenge, I realized, is not about making others suffer. It's about building yourself so fully that the ones who doubted you witness your rise, powerless to interfere, and forced to acknowledge that you were never theirs to control.